Hi, my name is Tara Wise. Welcome to sewing class. Today we're going to learn how to sew one of 3 different projects. You will have signed up for one of them. If you enjoy doing that, you can do all 3. Our choices today include a backpack pin. We have this pattern and some others in the handouts, or you can choose to create your own. Or a superhero cuff. The other project is a stuffed animal. We have patterns for a bear, a dolphin, or a snake. You can choose to use one of these or make your own. Now, I got all of these projects, and there are many others in this book called Sewing School by Amy Petronas Plumley and Andrea Lisley. This book is full of great ideas just for kids for learning how to sew. I hope you enjoy this class. We're going to start with a few different basic techniques that you need to learn in order to do any of these projects and any other kinds of sewing projects you might want to do. We're going to start with how to choose fabric, learning how to thread a needle, how to sew on a button, and how to do a few basic stitches. Thanks for joining me. Our first mini lesson is going to be how to choose fabric for your project. There's a lot of fabric choices out there. There's fun things like fleece, like your pajamas might be made of, or you might have a fleece blanket. This used to be pajamas. This is an old t-shirt. It's kind of worn out. This one will be good for a lot of the projects. This particular t-shirt is not very stretchy. And the great thing about t-shirt material is that it doesn't fray on the edges. So these two are great choices because they don't fray on the edges for your projects. Another great choice is craft felt. You can buy this in the fabric store or a craft store, and you probably have made things with this. This also does not pull on the edges. So when I talk about a fabric that frays on the edge, I mean something like this. This is a nice flannel fabric, but if you look at the edges, you can see that they're kind of pulling apart. And if I try to sew this near the edge, what's going to happen is it'll pull out and my project will fall apart. And so we don't want to use a fabric that can pull out on the edges and ruin our project. So this one is not a good choice for these kinds of projects, although it's great for something else. And this one too is a quilting cotton that also, for these kinds of projects, if you stitch too near the edge, it can pull out and your project just won't be as nice. A couple sources for projects then, or for fabrics, if you don't have a fabric stash, you can look at old clothes with an adult's permission, something maybe that doesn't fit you or has been ruined with holes. This one used to be pajamas, but now we've outgrown it and they had holes in the feet. This too used to be a really nice t-shirt, but again, it's past its prime. But it's perfect for a project like this. Now again, there's some fabrics that fray on the edges. Button-down shirts, for example, probably won't be a great choice. Another kind of fabric that won't be a great choice is a t-shirt that is very stretchy. This shirt stretches a lot. So it's not going to be as great for these projects because when you stuff things into them or try and do stuff with them, it'll stretch out of shape and your project won't look as nice. This t-shirt is not stretchy. So you kind of want to look for that if you're looking for fabrics, something that's not as stretchy like this one and doesn't fray like this one. And here's another old fabric choice. This is a pair of jeans that has holes in them. So this one would be not too bad, but jeans do kind of fray on the edge, so I would recommend not using jeans for these projects either. In this little mini lesson, we're going to learn how to thread a needle. So, the very most important thing you need to know about a needle is that because they are sharp, you need to always know where your needle is. If you're not using it, you need to have it pushed into a fabric or somewhere safe. Because if you drop this, you do not want to find it 2 days later with your feet. That will hurt. So, when you thread a needle, you take it out of your safe place and you start with getting a good amount of thread. Now, a pretty good amount is usually about as long as your arm. You do not want to go longer than that. It gets to be too hard to work with. If you run out while you're sewing, you can always tie a knot and start it again. So, I have a piece here that's a pretty good length, and I'm going to cut the end. This particular kind of thread is called a craft thread. It's pretty thick and it kind of looks similar to embroidery thread, but it's easy to sew with, easy to see, and it's nice and strong, and it comes in lots of fun colors. This needle is called a chenille needle. It has a nice big head that is pretty easy to get your thread into. And because we're sewing with fabric, it has a sharp-ish point to get through the fabric. Other kinds of needles that are similar to this, like an embroidery needle, also have a big head, but their end might be dull so that it can fit through the holes in embroidery. That'd be a really frustrating kind of needle to use for sewing. So you want a needle with a point if you're sewing through fabric. And you want to make sure that the eye of the needle is bigger than the thread that you're trying to use. So again, this is craft thread, but you can use regular thread. You could even use a skinny string if you have a needle that's big enough. Kind of all depends on what's available to you. Now, so I'm going to show 2 different ways to thread this needle. So this little needle threader is called a low-ran. And if you have one of these, here's how this works. You put your needle over it like this and kind of hang it on this little hooky space. Then you take your thread and you loop your thread into the hook. So you have kind of an arrangement that looks like this. And then you pull your needle over the end and you have your thread on and you're ready to go. So that's very convenient, but if you don't have that, then you can take this end here, and this end is the end I just cut. It's usually an easier end to work with. And I usually kind of lick it to make it damp and flat. It just helps an awful lot with getting it into the needle. And then you poke it into the needle end. And there you go, like that. So we have our needle threaded, and now we're going to want to tie a knot at the other end. And this is kind of like what you do to tie your shoes. You just put one side over and poke it through and pull it tight, just like that. And now you are ready to start sewing. And we'll talk about why we need this knot in the next video. In this lesson, we're going to go over a couple basic stitches. You will have your thread that you learned how to thread onto your needle in the last lesson, and you tied a knot on the end so that when you start stitching, the thread doesn't just pull right on through your fabric. So we're going to do the whip stitch and the running stitch. This first one is the whip stitch. You take your 2 pieces of fabric and you put them next to each other where you want them to be. So when you're sewing 2 pieces of fabric together, it's nice to have some pins or clips to hold them together so that they don't move away from each other and then you start sewing wrong. For this, I'd like to use safety pins. You can stick them in and shut them so that you don't accidentally poke yourself. Or if you prefer, it's a little bit easier, but also a little bit riskier, you can use straight pins. You just want to be careful to try to not poke yourself because they're sharp and you might bleed. So we have our thread, we have our fabric pieces that are stuck together so they don't come apart. And with the whip stitch, you just go in near the edge, you poke your needle through, and here on the back side you see we've got our knot that doesn't poke through. And then we run the needle around the thread and the needle around the outside. So you keep coming up from the bottom like this. So here I pulled it up, I'm going to come back around and poke it in through the bottom again. And we're going to just keep doing this all along this edge. And now this edge of these two pieces of fabric is stuck together. They're not going to be able to come apart. Now something else you'll notice is that my stitches are fairly close together. That way, when you try and say stuff your project, if you're going to do the stuffies, your insides don't come apart or your fabric doesn't pull apart. So here I'll show you what a longer stitch can do. Right here, I'm going to make a very long stitch. And here, I can stick my finger right through there, and stuffing can stick out through there too. So we want to try and keep them close together. So the whip stitch goes around the outside, just from the bottom up, every time. The running stitch, see now that my fabric's stuck together, I can take out the needle. It's not going to go anywhere. The running stitch, it alternates. You go down, and then you go up. And this one you maybe have done before in classes or with threading boards or that sort of thing. But this one goes back and forth, and instead of the thread going around the outside, it just goes along next to the outside. But either way, you're going to end up with two pieces of fabric that are stuck together. Just like this. Now, when you get to the end, you're going to tie another knot, or if your thread gets short and you're still working on it, you're still going to do the same thing. You're going to tie a knot, and it'll be just like the first one. But with this one, what you can do is stick your needle near there and tie your knot around the needle. Just loop it around the needle a couple times and then pull it out like this. And then if you stick your needle back in this loop, like that, while you pull it down, your knot will stay right next to the fabric. Or you can kind of just do it the other way. But here you see I've got a nice new knot right next to the fabric. And I cut it off, and I'm done. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to sew on a button. Like in the last lesson where we were sewing a line, we need to start by tying a knot at the end of our string. Now I have a variety of buttons here, and just about any of them will work. This one has 4 holes, this one here has just 2 holes, but that's fine, either one will do. Now I have one button here that's not a great choice for this particular project. This button here has a thing in the back called a shank, which helps it stick out from the fabric. For this particular project, that's not a great button, but any of the rest of these will be fine. You can get buttons at craft stores and fabric stores, or if with an adult's permission. You've got some old clothes with buttons that are worn out or otherwise not needed anymore. You can scavenge buttons off of old clothes. So to sew on a button, you start by picking your button, and it's handy to mark the spot where you want to put it so that it's easy to remember, especially if you're choosing where to put your button earlier in your project. So then I will hold the button over top of the spot I want to put it on, and I'll like pinch it between my fingers on the fabric. Now this part's a little bit trickier just because you have to stick the needle in from the back side and you can't see what you're doing. So it usually takes me a couple tries to figure out where the buttonhole is. It's in there somewhere. Maybe right here. Nope. We'll try this other one. Oop, shoot. There we go. So now I have the first one, and it's going to be a lot easier after the first one. But that first one takes a little trying. So then you come up from the back side through the first hole, then you go back down through the next hole and the fabric. So now my button is attached to the fabric and I don't have to pinch it quite so carefully. But you want to go back, since this one has 4 holes, I'm going to come back and I'm going to go through the other pair of holes. And it's a lot easier to find those holes once you've got the first couple in. Like that. And I like to do this a couple of times because I want my buttons to stay put once they're there and never ever come off again. There we go. Now there are some other tricks for when you're sewing buttons on clothes and things, but I'm not going to show you those today. If you want to learn that kind of thing, you can ask an adult or find one of lots of different tutorials on the internet. So I've done all of my stitches, and then I'm going to tie a knot, and again this is the end knot, just like when you're sewing a line of a stitch. So I have it knotted on there. This button is not going to fall off. And I snip my thread and I am all set. I have a button stuck on that will never come off. In this class, we're going to learn how to make a backpack pin. I have a handout here that you can download or you might get as a handout in your packet. It has a material list and some basic instructions, so you can follow along with the video or you might be able to follow along just from the written instructions. Now on here I've got 2 patterns. One is for making the Crazy Daisy pin, which is this one right here. And the other one is called the Go This Way pin, and that one has a circle and a triangle. They both are pins, they both have buttons in the middle. They're just different shapes. If you like one of these, that's great, make this one. Or you can come up with your own ideas, whatever you like. For this project, you'll need this pattern. You'll need a couple of pieces of fabric, and I've chosen this piece of felt here. And this little piece of denim here. Now I know in the fabric choosing section I said don't use denim because it can fray. For this particular project, because you're not sewing around on the edges, if it frays a little on the edge, that's not going to be a very big deal. So if you have a pair of old jeans or another piece of jean material that you really like, that will work for this project. So you'll need your fabric, you will need 1 button to go in the middle of the project, you'll need your thread and your needle, And you will also need oat scissors to cut with. And for the back side, you will need a pin. Now this is for pinning onto backpacks or maybe a pin on your shirt. And this little pin is like this. It has in the middle a flat area with little circles. So this works really well. If you don't have one of these, you can also make this project with a safety pin. It's very similar. It doesn't have the little circles, but you can sew around the back side of the pin and you can hang it on your backpack or whatever else you want to hang it on. So it kind of depends on what you have available to you. I'm going to use this special pin back, but a safety pin will work just fine too. So I'm going to make this go this way pin down at the bottom here. Since I already have a Crazy Daisy pin, I don't need two of those. I'll make the other one. So we start out by cutting out the shapes. This one has a circle on the back. All right, so there's the circle, and we have a triangle shape on the front. All right. So then, because I want to copy these onto the fabric, I'm going to pin this on here with the safety pin. You could trace it onto your fabric too with a marker. Then you might have marker outlines on your fabric when you're done though, and I'd prefer not to have that. So this felt is a little bit stiffer, so it's a little bit trickier to pin things onto. But see, I have it on there, so it won't move and it won't fall off while I'm cutting around it. And I'm just going to cut that very same shape into the felt. Alright, so there I have my circle. And then I'm going to cut the triangle onto the denim. Well, it's more of an arrow. And like that, see again, this isn't going to fall off while I cut around it. Sometimes these thicker fabrics can be a little bit harder to cut. So I have here a nice kid's safety scissors. If that's hard for you to use, maybe you can borrow an adult scissors. One that might be a little bit sharper than this one. So don't give up just because it's hard to cut, because sometimes that's just a problem of needing a slightly different scissors. There we go. All right. So I have my round shape and I have my arrow shape. Right there. And so when the project is all done, this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to have the round shape with the arrow and then the button right there in the middle. And I'm going to use the button to hold the two pieces of fabric together. So then I'm going to sew on the button just like we did in the last button sewing class. Now, some of these details like sewing on the button, if I go through this too quickly for you and you need to see it more carefully, go back to the little lesson that I did a few minutes back where we did the sewing on a button. And you can look at that more carefully. You can watch it over again if you like until you've got it figured out. So I've cut out my thread. I'm going to put it on the needle. And again, you can go back to the needle threading class if you need a reminder. And I'm going to tie a little knot at the end. All right, there's my little knot. And now I've got this all lined up just the way I want it. So I'm going to carefully pinch it together and try really hard for it to not move. And then go to the back side, and this is just the button sewing lesson. This is exactly what that is. There's nothing different here. And we're going to poke through the back side until we find that buttonhole, which might take a minute. Especially with these thicker fabrics, it's a little bit trickier. Sometimes it helps actually to poke through the front side first, just to figure out about where you're looking at. So I just poked my needle through the front, and I didn't pull the thread through. I'm going to pull it back out, and okay, great, I've got a little hole in the back, so that helps me figure out where to go. There we go, now I have it. Okay, so I have that, and then I can go down. All right, and now that I'm through 2 of these holes, I don't need to pinch it so hard. It's not going to move. And I'm going to put a couple more stitches in there, just so that it does not fall apart. Now I have all of these instructions on this handout too, so if you're not watching the video, you can still follow along on the handout and get most of the same information. Alright, so I went through that a few times. This is not going to come apart ever. Alright, and I'm going to tie a knot on the back side. Okay, now I'm already back here with my thread, so I'm not going to cut it this time. This time I am going to take my little pin back and I'm going to stick it here, and I'm going to come up through the hole. Now if you don't have the holes, again, you can use a safety pin, and you just stitch around the safety pin a couple of times. So here I'm going up through the middle, but I'm going to be tricky and try and go only through the back fabric and not into the front fabric this time. So I kind of fold it over a little bit here. That way you can't see your back stitches from the front side. And then I'm going to come around and do a couple more stitches around the pin or your safety pin, whichever you have, so that it stays in the same place. And try and keep it sneaky and going only through the back fabric. You kind of have to bend things around a little bit to do that, but that's fine. Fabric can do that. All right. Like that. There we go. See? Looking great. And then here, you're going to want to tie your fabric around just the pin or just the safety pin. And get yourself a good little knot in there so that it doesn't come off. Alright, so I'm just tying a knot here, just like we've done before. And I cut the string off, and there we go. We have this very cool little pin, and back here we have our clasp. And that's it. So you can make tons of these, you can make all different shapes and sizes, it's whatever you like. That is really a cool thing about sewing. Any project you do is going to be yours only. It will not look like anybody else's. It'll be special and individual. Thank you for joining sewing class this year. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy sewing again in the future.